We now turn to the second panel of the day, which will also focus on policy making and open science. I am delighted to invite Ms. Susan Veldsman, who will be the moderator of this panel. Susan Veldsman was appointed to the position of Director, Scholarly Publication Unit at the Academy of Sciences in South Africa in January 2009. She is responsible to drive the open science agenda by advocating for the opening up of the entire research process, from agenda setting to the dissemination of findings. Raising the visibility, discoverability, and accessibility of South African scholarly journals through open access, improve the quality of South African research output, find ways and solutions to further support the development of policy frameworks in order to facilitate optimal use and access to publicly funded research. She received the Electronic Publishing Trust Award for her outstanding contribution to the promotion of open access in developing countries. Early in her career, she started off as a librarian at various higher education institutions. During 2002, she moved to the South African National Library and Information Consortium, where she was responsible for negotiating access to commercial databases and was actively involved in promoting open science and setting up institutional repositories. She continued this work in 2006 in an international consortium, the Electronic Information for Libraries Network, in other transitional and developing member countries worldwide. Ms. Veldsman, the floor is yours.
Thank you, Chair. Good afternoon, ladies and gentlemen. For us in South Africa, it's good afternoon. So wherever you are in the world, good day then. It's very nice to meet up electronically today. And thank you very much for joining us for this particular session. I think it's good that this is the second panel discussion on the actual theme of policy making and open science. This panel, I think, will build very nicely on the previous discussions that has just been offered to us right now. There's a call worldwide that the whole and the entire research cycle, life cycle, should actually open up, especially and including data that is needed in order for evidence to inform actions to achieve sustainable development goals and reach commitments to the Paris Agreement on climate change, as well as the distribution of climate research and data. Open science, which has definitely accelerated during COVID-19, especially in a developing country like South Africa, where it can help for us to advance to not only to manufacture the vaccines for the COVID-19, but also to share the data with the rest of the world as to what is happening, etc. However, there also might be new challenges such as misinformation, a complete distrust in information, the spread of false information, and then the potential for the distortion of open science principles. This panel then will explore these recent trends, including new open science policies and non-alignment challenges, and point to lessons learned during the current crisis that can support open science about climate change and strengthen the climate action. So this afternoon, we have four very distinguished presenters to this session: Dr. Jenny Barber, Dr. Monica Granados, Dr. Alina Rebgina, and Dr. Cameron Nine. Colleagues, it's very nice to see you again online. So Dr. Jenny Barber is Professor, Barber is Director of the Open Access Australasia and is a co-lead office for Scholarly Communications, Queensland University of Technology. Dr. Monica Granados is the Senior Policy Advisor, Environment and Climate Change in Canada. Did some very interesting studies and discovered that the incentives in academia promote practices that make knowledge less accessible. So that's quite an interesting matter. And Dr. Alina Rebgina, she's a Deputy Director for Development of the Geophysical Center, Russian Academy of Sciences, Chief Laboratory of Innovation Projects, a Vice President of CoData. And Dr. Cameron Nine, the Head of Open Science, and also involved in the very renowned initiative worldwide, and that is the sponsoring consortium for open access publishing in particle physics, scope 3, which is a global collaboration and has set a standard specifically for the access to information and to open information as such. So colleagues, it is absolutely my delight to welcome you all, and we're really looking forward to your presentations. Just for your information that it's 10 minutes for each of your presentations. I will warn you 1 minute before your time is up. And then I would like to invite all the participants on this call to please drop your messages and your questions in the question and answer boxes that's visible on your screen. So first, I would like to invite Dr. Ginny Barber to please address this webinar this afternoon. Thank you, Doctor.
All right, thank you, Susan, and thank you very much to the organisers of this conference for the opportunity to speak. I'm really delighted to be here to present a perspective from Australia and New Zealand, and very honoured. So my name is Ginny Barber. As Susan said, I'm the Director of Open Access Australasia, and I'm physically based in Brisbane, which is halfway up the east coast of Australia. And if you weren't sure where that was until recently, you may now know that we've been awarded the Olympics in 2032, so I hope that many of you will eventually be able to travel to us then. Before we begin, I'd like to just acknowledge the traditional owners of the lands that I'm on, the Turrbal and Yagra people, and pay my respects to their elders past, present and emerging. And I'd also like to acknowledge any First Nations people who may be here on this call today. Obviously, I can't cover everything, and so I very much welcome any follow-up. In putting this talk together, I'd like to thank many colleagues who made suggestions, and I'll apologise in advance if I didn't cover everything that was suggested. Just to note that my focus is on open science in the pandemic rather than the details of research per se, though of course Australian and New Zealand researchers were active contributors to the huge amount of open research that happened during the pandemic. So the group that I'm representing is Open Access Australasia, which is supported by members across Australia and New Zealand. We collaborate with many organisations across our region and internationally, and I'd like to acknowledge the important work of all of those groups. In our principles, we recognise a theme that I think I've just really heard today more and more, which is the importance of an equitable, diverse, open ecosystem that maximises the impact of research and supports its quality. And again, of importance in particular in our region is the need for appropriate and respectful use of Indigenous knowledges. So I'm going to cover these four areas outlined here, ranging from specific open science initiatives that happened in our region triggered by COVID-19, a national discussion that happened in Australia. I'll talk about what 2020 looks like in open science in this region, and then conclude with some thoughts on what I think we can learn from the pandemic. This slide illustrates the diversity of approaches to the coordination of open science that happened across this region. Early on, Dr. Alan Finkel, who was Australia's chief scientist last year, was part of international calls, some of which we've heard about, for research to be made open in response to the pandemic. His office took the lead in other initiatives, so for example, the Rapid Research Information Forum, which provided advice to the Australian government. Australia's Learned Academies coordinated a COVID-19 expert database, and the Australian Academy of Science developed a COVID-19 news and resources hub. They commissioned also commentary on the importance of open science for a non-specialist audience, and we heard again about the importance of that. And the piece that I've just highlighted here is one that I wrote with the chair of Open Access Australasia, Martin Borchert. Their work continues, including important work analysing the effect, for example, of the pandemic on women in the STEM sector, which we know has been problematic. The Australian National Health and Medical Research Council provided support for a wide range of initiatives, and the Australian Research Data Commons provided the infrastructure that allowed the data sharing for many Australian researchers in the pandemic. In New Zealand, the Ministry of Business, Innovation and Employment created a COVID-19 research database and has analysed the New Zealand research response to the pandemic. So one particular issue that we heard about is the importance of really good science communication. And in that regard, New Zealand was an exemplar. During COVID-19, Dr. Susie Wiles, a microbiologist at the University of Auckland, joined forces with cartoonist Toby Morris to make the science of the pandemic clear and understandable. Importantly, they released their work with a Creative Commons license, which, as we know, is very important in making research outputs openly available, but that ensured that their graphics could be translated into multiple languages, and they have been adapted widely as part of pandemic communications globally. However, even before the pandemic emerged, there was work in progress on a national approach to open research in Australia. Our group worked with the Council of Australian University Librarians, and we took a systematic approach to moving discussions forward on open science. We were initially stalled as we intended to meet in Canberra by the COVID pandemic, but we were able to reconvene online, and throughout the year we had a number of discussions with national and international experts, including roundtables, webinars and focus consultations. And we took some lessons away from that work. In general, we found there was much to learn from other countries in developing an open research approach. It's not necessary for Australia, or indeed for any country, to wholly invent any process. There is no one prescribed route or starting point. Often what happens, it starts with a coalition of the willing, and I think that's a good lesson for us. There were some components that were essential, and one in particular was the need for a high-level champion or sponsor with good links to government, wide consultation and buy-in across the sector, and dedicated logistical support in order to ensure that any approach can be properly resourced. As part of that work, we developed case studies with colleagues from the University of New South Wales and the University of New England, and there's a couple here. The top case study highlights the lack of access to research into the pandemic, even by policy advisors within government, and that we understand and we know severely slows down the advice that policymakers are able to provide to government itself. And the second case study illustrated the lack of coordination and infrastructure support for mapping fires in the terrible 2019 bushfire season that we had in Australia. So what's happening in 2021? So there's a few things to bring to your attention in the policy area. First of all, Dr. Cathy Foley, who is now Australia's chief scientist, has named open access as one of the key pillars of her strategic work, and she is the Australian government's champion for open access in Australia. She's leading work to explore a model that will work in the Australian context, and her vision is a model for access to everyone within Australia and access to Australia's research, and that will support and be a key enabler of innovation. To this end, Dr. Foley is undertaking an extensive consultation, and I have at the bottom of this slide just put her email address should anyone wish to follow up with her. She's welcomes an approach. Secondly, the NHMRC, the National Health and Medical Research Council in Australia, undertook a review of its open access policy, which previously had required open access with a 12-month embargo. Their proposal is that research outputs funded by them should now be immediately available with a Creative Commons attribution license, and the NHMRC is currently reviewing the feedback on its consultation. And third, the Australian Academy of Science has updated its open science statement, highlighting the importance of openness across the entire research lifecycle. With regard to advocacy and analysis, I'd like to just highlight the ongoing work of the Council of Australian University Librarians on their Advancing Fair and Open Scholarship Programme and in negotiating transformative agreements. Our work at Open Access Australasia continues with a reaffirmation of principles, especially for openness to support equity and a diverse open ecosystem, as well as the FAIR guiding principles, which again we've heard earlier today: findable, accessible, interoperable and reusable, the critical importance, for example, of high quality metadata. We also just want to note the importance of the CARE principles and associated with that for Indigenous data governance. And there is other work ongoing led by the Australian Research Data Commons, such as projects in areas such as bushfire mitigation. In New Zealand, there's analysis led by the Council of New Zealand University Librarians, and that's been important in quantifying open access there. So what have we learnt really from the pandemic for the next crisis? It's really clear that we need an open research ecosystem. This has to include data sharing, open peer review, and a reform of the associated incentive systems that support such work, such as the activities championed by Dora, and we've heard about this earlier in this meeting today. We need to design the system for equity. There were some advances as a result of the pandemic in that area, and I think, in fact, the very fact we're all able to meet here online today is a triumph of equity. There were some very specific examples that were highlighted by the pandemic, such as the importance of open books. But we can't take any of this for granted. We're already seeing publishers putting COVID papers back behind paywalls. For example, critical work on vaccine development. These papers were never truly open, but were just free essentially on a publisher's whim. We need open access now, just as we've needed it for the past 20 years, and the pandemic has shown us that we can successfully address big problems when research is fully open. Publishers, and indeed any other organisations who are part of research dissemination, need to recognise their service providers, and if they are willing to charge, if they charge a fair and reasonable fee, they'll have a future. Otherwise, the community will simply work around them, as we found with the preprints during the pandemic. And to further open science, we need to make sure that investments in underlying software and systems are similarly designed. Open research on closed commercial tools limits progress towards advancing open science. We need global coordination and investment in shared infrastructure, such as the work that Invest in Open is leading, so we have a system that supports equitable access to and participation in research. And we need a shared agenda that identifies where needs are globally, strategies to align and increase resourcing for these programs and infrastructure. So I'll leave you with one final thought. I think we need imaginative and radical thinking about how to design, invest and support open science so that we're not perpetuating a dysfunctional system of prestige, limited access and privilege. Otherwise, we simply will not be able to equitably and efficiently address the enormous global challenges ahead of us. Thank you very much.
Thank you, Dr. Barber, and thank you very much for highlighting those most important issues again, science communication is emerging again, and the open access to research. And I think those are two very important principles in going forward. I would like to invite Dr. Granados now, who is the Senior Policy Advisor, Environment and Climate Change in Canada. Thank you, Doctor.
Thank you so much. So yes, once again, thank you so much for the invitation to talk a little bit about specifically open science in the Canadian federal government. So I'm really talking here about some of the initiatives and policies that we have in place in the Canadian federal government. So that means for the science that federal scientists, so scientists that work for the federal government, and the policies that we're implementing towards that specific science in Canada. So again, in that context, there's a couple of policy drivers that I want to talk to you about to give you some context about what's happening in the federal government in Canada. Open science has been a priority for the government of Canada since at least 2014, when we started to get involved in the Open Government Partnership. So we have a couple of policy drivers that I want to talk to you about to give you this context. The first is the Open Government Partnership. So Canada is a member of the Open Government Partnership. It is a consortium of countries that are moving towards having open and transparent government. And the last 3 national action plans on open government have included an open science commitment and then milestones, so specific deliverables on things that they're going to meet to forward open science. I want to talk to you a little bit about the last the national action plan that we had. The 4th national action plan also had an explicit open science commitment. And what did we have in there? So we had performance measures and reporting. So we wanted to do an assessment of the progress in implementing open science in the federal government. We also did engagement sessions with open science users. So we did virtual and in-person engagement sessions to go to people who are doing open science, who want to be using open science, and to ask what can the federal government do to make open science more accessible, so more pervasive, and what are barriers that you are encountering to practicing in the open or to open science practices. Importantly, there was also the delivery of the Chief Science Advisor's Open Science Roadmap. So the roadmap that I'll tell you a little bit about in the next slide details 10 recommendations to make federal science more open and accessible. And there's also a pilot of an open science portal, so a way to make the science that the federal government is doing more accessible to Canadians, to other scientists, and then just people in the world as well. We are now embarking on the 5th National Action Plan, and here is where we're getting that interface of open science and climate change. So first of all, the 5th National Action Plan is going to focus on 5 themes. They include combating disinformation and safeguarding elections, financial and corporate transparency, justice, open data for results, and then importantly, there's a fifth commitment on climate change and sustainable growth. And this is born from a citizen's desire to know more about government decisions on climate change and sustainable development. So the Treasury Board Secretariat here in Canada went out and asked people, what do you want to see from your government? And one of those was, we want to know more about how climate change science is done, how decisions are made. You know, the want was there from citizens for this science, these decision-making processes to be more open and more transparent. So there's going to be a commitment explicitly on climate change science and sustainable growth and how that can be made more open and transparent, including measuring science publications specifically on climate change and how open and transparent those publications are. So right now we're in the draft stage for the 5th National Action Plan. They're open for public comment, and at the end of the presentation, I'll give you a link that you can follow to provide your comments if you're interested. So from the 4th National Action Plan, we had the delivery of that roadmap for open science. So this is sort of the second big policy driver. So the first was the Open Government Partnership and having a commitment around open science in these 2-year action plans. The other is the roadmap. So it was released in early 2020. It was led by the Office of the Chief Science Advisor here in Canada, and it details 10 recommendations to make federal science open to all. So it's got a series of recommendations, but I'm going to talk to you about 2 important ones that I think this audience is interested in. The first is to make federal science articles openly accessible, and that means immediately accessible by January 2020, and federal science publications open by January 2023. The difference here is that one is the peer-reviewed publications that you're familiar with. The second is our internal publications. So the federal government also produces publications that are not published by journals, but are published in-house, and those also need to be open and accessible to the public. The second here that I'm going to highlight is that federal departments and agencies need to develop strategies and tools towards fair data. So there is, again, a focus here on open access and open data, but there are a series of other 8 recommendations, including that every department and agency that is engaging in science has to develop an action plan. So this action plan has to say, okay, we've read these 10 recommendations. Here is how we're going to implement it in the science that our departments and agencies are doing. And so those are starting to trickle out. And over the course of the summer, these action plans should start to be made public so that Canadians in the world can see how federal science departments and agencies are going to make their science more open and transparent. So that's just a brief overview of what 2 important policy drivers here in Canada. Specifically, I think something that's really exciting to this audience is this upcoming 5th National Action Plan and the commitment to have openness and transparency around climate change and sustainable growth. What I want to highlight here is that many of the conversations that we've had today so far, many of the presentations have highlighted the importance of open science. I think the recognition that even just science itself is incredibly valuable when we're tackling global problems. But something that I noticed is also that this was sort of almost like a micro experiment that allowed us to see that open science is implementable. Open science is not a new concept. It's been around for a long time. We've been calling for, open access and open data for decades. And it took a pandemic to show that it was implementable, that we could make data immediately accessible, that we could, embrace preprints, that we can make articles immediately accessible. But it took a global problem to show that. And as climate change becomes an increasingly bigger and bigger threat, if we wait until it's a threat, if we wait till that tipping point, like it was for the pandemic, I think that that is too late. And that shouldn't take this tipping point for us to implement these practices. We've been talking about implementing them for a very long time. And I think what we need to focus on is how do we actually make that shift? We know what we need to do. How do we implement these practices that we know will make science better? And if we wait until climate change is an even bigger threat, that may be too late. I want to end with the last slide here. As I mentioned, we are still in the process of drafting or of getting input onto our draft commitments in the 5th National Action Plan. So if you go to letstalkopengov.ca/participate, you can comment on any of the commitments, including the one on climate change and sustainable growth. And if you want more information on our 4th National Action Plan or our roadmap for open science, I provided some links here. Thank you so much for your attention.
Thank you, Dr. Granados, for reminding us the role that government actually plays in setting the scene for open science, especially through partnerships, action plans and roadmaps. I think that's very important. And I also agree with your last remark, namely that open science is actually key in looking at climate change and specifically when we talk about the COVID-19 pandemic and the role of open research as such. So thank you very much for that. I would like to invite Dr. Elena Rybakina, who is the Deputy Director for the Development of the Geophysical Center, the Russian Academy of Sciences, Chief Laboratory of Innovation Projects, as well as the Vice President of CoData. Dr. Rybakina, over to you. Please share your presentation with us.
Thank you very much. Thank you for this introduction, and for me it's a great honor to be here. In my short presentation, I will speak about building foundation for a world of open data and open science, being as our officer of CoData. But before I start, actually, I wish to use this great opportunity to speak on this conference to give your not only CoData perspective, but also the national perspective. So as I'm not only CoData Vice President, I'm also a researcher, I'm a geologist, and I'm physically based in Moscow in the National Academy of Science. I wish to share with you that we had a huge shift in the open data policy on a national level in Russia. And answering the question of our panel, yes, we see the progress, and pandemic did put us in the position where we have no other way rather than progress in data sharing and visibility for our research, even if we were not that much progressive in this field before. So as we didn't have a plan B, we had no time to create it, and we can now clearly identify the interrelation between the adopted data policy and number of new research initiatives appeared. So better data sets lead us to new approaches and new research that appear, and for sure, open data, advanced collaboration in the science community, accelerate scientific discovery, and it's never been so clear as it is now. I'm sure that on every national level we have our own experience, and probably it is not unique, and we have national heroes, national research that been working on the COVID-19 data because this data was available on the governmental level, and many new open resources were created by people and for people. Pandemic didn't change the direction of open data policy in Russia, but it's definitely accelerated its development. So I wish now if we could go abroad these data sets and apply the same principles more widely. So why not be so proactive in other scientific and research fields like geology, again, like climate change, make it visible, make it interoperable. And this is the crucial point, as I wish to make bold, that there is a need and opportunity to unite existing initiatives and accelerate the development of core services to help meet the current crisis. And we must manage expectations and be clear on the limitations of what can be achieved. At the same time, it is essential to rise to the challenge and ensure that what is implemented for COVID-19 is sustainable and scalable. The lesson we learn here, this particular project, that cross-domain approach and interoperability of data is crucial. And open science, the way we define it, make the research process and data collection more transparent, enhance interoperability, ensure an access to knowledge resources globally. And this is exactly what we've been advocating within CODATA for the decades. So I will not talk a lot about and speak about CODATA's mission. I'm sure that CODATA is well known for many of our participants here. It's a committee on data of the International Science Council. We said our mission is to connect data and people to advance science and improve our world. From particular part, our mission is to advocate a best data management practices and provide a data policy on the global level. So we do so specifically by promoting open science and fair data. I'm very happy that for the whole day in so many presentations we hear about FAIR principles, and it's great because it comes from many domains. When we speak about CODATA strategy, we can identify 4 principles areas of our activity. Among them, the first one will be data policy, and I think this is the specific niche of CODATA. So we have a CODATA Data Policy Committee, and each year we provide a major report on policy statement on the variety of issues. We also do work on data science. We're not making data science, but we're working to support data science by providing tools for researchers, by advocating the best data practices, by producing and developing a data science journal, as well as other international conference and regional events. We also work on data skills and education, and this is a very important part because we need to raise a new generation of researchers that already have no data boundaries. So if I can say so, it's not about skills, it's just a specific set of mind so this will bring us to the world where data is open by default and where people have this idea and where data management principles are defined before the data have ever been created. So this is why it's extremely important. And finally, it's the 4th column. This is the data to improve our world, and this is including the promotion of the open science platforms and preparation of the decadal program, making data work for cross-domain grand challenges. So CODATA is about national committees. So where our main focus is to engage with the national members, influence and contribute to CODATA. And not only we see our mission in building an effective collaboration with other bodies. Let me know if you still see my slides because I've lost it. but I will, anyway, I will continue. Okay, it's good. So
Dr. Lipkin, if I may, we took over the slides because they were frozen. So you just tell us next slide, and colleagues will follow up.
Thank you very much. Next slide, please. So not only national committees, it's also about institutional institutional members. Next slide, please. So we have ISC members like international scientific unions, associations, and other bodies related, institutional members, and partner organizations. We have already underlined their importance of the better communications. So what I wish to emphasize in my talk, the importance of avoiding overlapping of our efforts and collaboration. We're not in the position to create a new committee. We're in the position to make this collaboration effective. So this is how therefore data together was created. Partnership is crucial, and CODATA together with GoFair, with the RDA and World Data System, this is 4 major international data organizations, outlined our joint commitment to work together to optimize their global research data ecosystem, to identify the opportunities and needs that will trigger federated infrastructures to service the new reality of data-driven science. And next slide, my last one. Thank you. So in response to the global needs in open science, we have jointly contended that it is essential to meet both the immediate needs and the long-term objectives by ensuring that data and science platforms and infrastructure are based on the FAIR principles. So you see on the slide all these 4 parts of this collaboration: CODATA, RDA, World Data System as the research program of ISC, and GoFair, a global initiative of community-driven implementation networks. In summary, the current situation requires the accelerated implementation of this FAIR ecosystem, and we need to act quickly, just not to lead to lowering our ambition as to what research and data infrastructure is needed. So we need to accept this view that conventional portal is sufficient without an underlying FAIR infrastructure. Through regular dialogue and strategic meetings, it is intended that this should become a framework and roadmap to address the challenges of global research for data together. So let me finish here and leave the floor for further discussion. Thank you.
Thank you, Dr. Rabina, and thank you very much for reminding us for the spread of services of CODATA, not only to set the standards, but also in terms of the activities to promote the sharing of data globally. Thank you for that. So our last speaker then is Dr. Kamran Naim. Kamran, over to you. Please share your slides.
Well, Susan, thank you very much for starters. Your Excellencies, ladies and gentlemen, thank you all, wherever you are around the world, for joining this incredibly interesting session today. I'd really first like to start off by thanking the conference organizers, to Thanos and to Ariel, for doing such a wonderful job and pulling together such a stellar lineup of speakers. And I'm honored to be included and to be speaking with you today. I'm really grateful to have the opportunity to share the perspective of CERN on this matter of critical global importance. In the face of COVID-19, as we've heard today, we've witnessed an unprecedented embrace of open science and a recognition of how it can help us accelerate towards solutions. So today I want to talk about how at CERN, we have a holistic embrace of open science, and how we aim to set the global example of how the practice of science can be organized to be more efficient, robust and responsive. So as many of you know, CERN is the European Organization for Nuclear Research. We're the world's largest high-energy physics lab located in Geneva in Switzerland. Our mission is to provide a unique range of particle accelerator facilities that enable research at the forefront of human knowledge. We aim to perform world-class research in fundamental physics and to unite people from all over the world to push the frontiers of science and technology. CERN is funded by contributions from our member states. And as a result, we feel an obligation to make sure that the results of our research benefit all member states and the international scientific community and beyond. We were armed with an early mandate for open science, which was in our founding convention. And we realized that the most effective way to deliver on our mission is through the practice of open science. But the complexity of the research we do makes comprehensively pursuing open science ever-evolving effort. We host thousands of researchers from all over the world. They work on multiple different experimental collaborations. We work with the world's largest scientific instruments and are the world's most prolific generators of scientific data. But we are supported by an organizational and disciplinary research culture that values openness. And we're fostering an ecosystem of initiative, projects, and technologies that have been built to maximize the impact of our research. And in this chart, you just see some of the different initiatives and technologies that we work on in this kind of ecosystem of interdependent and interoperable systems that advance open science. I'll touch on just a few, but as you can see, we also have enabling policies, our open access policy, which was instituted in 2013, an organizational open data policy in 2020. We released open hardware, open source software, which included quite famously the software for the World Wide Web, which I believe is one of the reasons we're here today. We systematically release open data. I'm going to talk about that in a moment, as well as some tools, and I'm going to discuss open access. We also engage on the infrastructure side in the European Open Science Cloud. So we're very interested in engaging broadly in interoperable and global approach towards sharing open data. So on open access, as many people have pointed out today, in response to the pandemic, we saw subscription publishers responding by removing paywalls on related research. And really, Thanos mentioned this earlier, but what we witnessed was this tacit admission by many of the world's leading publishers and in some ways gatekeepers of knowledge that open access is the most effective way at accelerating towards solutions in times of crisis. And that the current predominantly paywalled model of scholarly publishing is, as my colleague Robert Kiley from the Wellcome Trust describes it, not fit for purpose in the 21st century. The efforts are also limited in scope, and they only concern a core of knowledge. As we know, COVID-19 affected multiple aspects of our lives. There were impacts on economies, mental health, the way we work, social unrest, domestic abuse, and beyond. Recent studies have shown that less than 1/3 of the interdisciplinary publications that reference COVID-19 were open access. So in mounting a response to the crisis on the scale of climate change, we should look at transitioning the entire system of scholarly publishing to open. We really can't go back. Efforts from publishers, as Ginny has already pointed out, were only temporary, and much content has begun to return behind a paywall. So we really need to work on ensuring unrestricted access. While we do that, we have to be careful that in advancing open access, we don't create additional barriers, and we make sure to build systems that are inclusive and empower voices from all over the world to participate in the global scientific conversation. On the policy side for open access, we've had an organizational OA policy since 2014. We've been able to transition the discipline of particle physics to almost 100% open access. The CERN library, as a matter of policy now, only enters into agreements that are transitioning our subscription spends away from paying to read to paying to publish OA. And the Scope 3 consortium, which is a global consortium, the sponsoring consortium for open access and particle physics, established in 2014, is a global initiative which is hosted at CERN, but is really run by representatives from 44 countries representing over 3,000 institutions that have worked collectively to fund the OA publishing of research in the discipline. And that really has been the major contributor towards us achieving this flip. We've been able to do this while avoiding any additional barriers for authors. So publishing in the journals is completely free of any author-facing charges. And we're proud to say that it's been an inspiration for other global initiatives. What we've also proven is that we can have systems that are equitable. So although the Scope 3 partnership currently consists of 44 countries, we hope to bring on others, but authors from over 120 countries around the world have been able to benefit from Scope 3 and the work we've done. So on OA, we believe that we need to align and institute policies that support a systemic transition to open access. Funded research outputs should be open by default. We need to promote cooperative approaches to open access that enable researchers to publish in trusted outlets with no financial barriers like the ones that Dr. Medize talked about earlier. And we need to, we encourage institutions to transition their subscription arrangements away from paying to read to paying for open access publishing services. On the data front, as many folks have already mentioned today, there was a global embrace of open data by research practitioners. That's been critical to reaching where we are now, but there are significant challenges. So as we've heard, data is not sufficiently fair, and there's been a lack of harmonization across different data providers. The explosion of research output also highlights the need for verifiability mechanisms. So, papers that are now published which say data available on request are no longer sufficient. We need to have access to the data in order to check the reproducibility and verifiability of research. At CERN, we instituted an open data policy in December of 2020. What this policy captures is that we believe that releasing data alone is not enough. And that to ensure that further scientific value can be generated from the data, experimental data should be accompanied by all the associated knowledge, so analyses, computational environments, workflows, notebooks, to ensure optimal scientific exploitation. This means that you need to have systematic analysis preservation mechanisms in place, and we've developed tools such as CERN analysis preservation, and then another tool called the Rihanna platform, which is a flexible and scalable reproducibility tool through which users can reinstantiate an analysis on the cloud and reuse and rerun data that we release to run their own analyses. Everything that we do is built on open source software, and we adopt fair and compliant data standards. We also host Zenodo, which is the world's largest multidisciplinary research data repository. And during the pandemic, Zenodo uses position to help the fight in the virus. It contains artifacts of relevance to COVID-19, including preprints, but also software and data sets. And by also enabling enhanced storage, Zenodo supported the needs of resource-deprived communities around the world that lacked their own infrastructure for data provision. So finally, our recommendations on open data are things that we've already heard. We need to develop governance models and policies that allow for open by default. We need frameworks for interoperability. We need to have clarifying incentives and recognition for researchers to adopt open practices, and really to shift culture to make sharing and openness the norm. We also believe that open data is not enough, and we need to advance this notion that data needs to be accompanied with the necessary artifacts to perform the research. I just want to leave you with this final thought, which is from Dr. Abdus Salam, who is the founder of the International Center for Theoretical Physics, and was a Pakistani scientist. And being Pakistani myself, he's a personal hero of mine. But this notion that scientific thought and its creation of the common and shared heritage of mankind really underlies this value of open science. At CERN, we believe that the global health pandemic has brought all the inadequacies of traditional science into sharp focus, and that the embrace of open science is the most effective way of addressing a crisis. It's our belief that we are at an inflection point and there should be no going back. Open should become the default standard for global research, and that will equip the community to better respond to current and future challenges and accelerate the advancement of the research enterprise itself to be more efficient, transparent, responsive, and dynamic. Thank you.
Thank you, Dr. Naim. Thank you very much for also starting to use words like transitional agreements with publishers. Coming from a developing world, we prefer transitional than transformative, as we are not always in the position to do actually transformative agreements, but rather transitional agreements, of which Scope 3 is also a very good example to us. As well as to remind us the importance of the policies that governments and institution organizations have to develop, because that still forms sort of the center point of rolling out open science in each country. So colleagues, there's some very interesting comments and remarks and questions coming from the floor. And the first one perhaps pertain a little bit more to the publishing side of things, and that is that scholarly communication is coming up as a central theme, again, throughout our discussions of this afternoon. So, in my view, because we expect journals and editors to carry out a gatekeeping role, weeding out poor research methods, low quality data, and so on. So there are many organizations at any level which audit the quality of gatekeeping carried out by publishers. Is there any way to know which publishers perform research integrity checks to an acceptable standard? Is there perhaps anybody from the panel that would like to take that question?
Yeah, Jenny, I'm happy to just take that quickly, but I'd also just make a couple of observations as a result of it. Yes, absolutely, there are organisations that work in this area. So the top guidelines, the transparency and openness guidelines, which developed by the Centre for Open Science, have been really important in kind of really laying out some of these policies and which publishers are kind of adhering to them. There are initiatives such as there's the group called the Committee on Publication Ethics, which also works on ensuring that journals kind of adhere to ethical approaches, and then there are some industry bodies. But I'd just like to sort of turn the question around a little bit and say that I think that the key really is that we need to think about a different system from the one we have at the moment. We know, just for example, if we went back to the last time we had a global emergency, when we had SARS, most of the research that was done on SARS was not published during the SARS pandemic. We know that. It was published years afterwards. What we've had in this pandemic, actually it wasn't a pandemic then, it was a global emergency, but what we have in this pandemic is this research was literally published, you know, almost in real time. We have a massive opportunity now to rethink the whole system and think about what are the quality indicators we want. And I'm just sorry to say, from somebody who's worked in traditional journals, that the traditional journals are not the way forward if we're going to think about a really true way of revolutionising science for the future.
I would like to go to the next sort of statement, which I was a bit surprised about, but let's hear from the panel whether they also experience it, particularly in their countries, namely that academic promotions sometimes do not take into account research published online in open journals. What can be done to shift policies like these and others that do not support open science? Do any of our panel members have experience of this statement happening in your own countries? In South Africa, definitely not. It doesn't matter whether you publish in open or closed journals, just as long as it's trusted journals. Thereby, we also recognize the Director of Open Access Journals to lead and to guide us as to which is seen as trusted open access journals as such. Any other comments through the panel?
I mean, I'm happy just to comment quickly. I think that some of this is just a myth that has, to be honest, been somewhat perpetuated by publishers in the past, traditional publishers. It's a sort of hangover from conversations 20 years ago. I think that I do know that there are some countries where this continues to be an issue, but I think just going back to one of the presentations we heard earlier about the UNESCO Open Science recommendation, one of the key parts of that is the need to understand what we mean by open science, to have an international conversation on what the norms are. And I think that will help enormously by removing some of these myths that are perpetuated that open science and open research is not good research.
I'm involved in another panel of predatory journals where there's a lot of criticism against openness and open journals and open publishing, etc., because that is perceived as being the main instigator and the cause of actually predatory journals and not trustworthy information as such. And I think we've got a number of work to do there, let alone if we move into the field of open data and the mistrust that sometimes are that's accompanied, especially from developing countries and where the data actually comes from. So there's a lot of work to be done there. There's also on the side happening some conversations about terminologies. What terminologies do we use? Do we use open science, open research? There's a suggestion for open knowledge. Do the panel have some ideas about what we should be using and whether open science is sufficient enough in describing this whole life cycle of research and the openness that accompanies it?
Yeah, sure. I mean, I am quite comfortable with the definition that was presented by our colleagues from UNESCO earlier today. And they do use the term open science. But they're clear to note that their definition includes all scientific disciplines and aspects of scholarly practices, including basic and applied sciences, natural and social sciences, and the humanities. And so they have a very inclusive definition, and that's good with me.
Also here on the side is that we must remember that the creators of the web at CERN did not patent it, allowing us to benefit from it. An example we should follow in innovations for open science. So I think that was a nice compliment to CERN and all the work they do there. I think that's really setting an example. Colleagues, we're slowly but surely running out of time here. I would like to ask each panel member for the last minute or so, and I go around, that you actually just conclude with a few final words, hearing what you've heard from the 4 panel members. What is the last advice and last thought, perhaps, that you would like to put forward for participants to this webinar?
As for my last comments, I think that we should have so we should learn from the pandemic because this pandemic present a major, let me say, test of our science system in many aspects, and as well for research and data infrastructures. And we just spoke about open data, open science, and open knowledge, even open research. And this is actually a significant challenge in ensuring data quality and risks of false and wrong information being disseminated as a fact during pandemic. And there should be a mechanism to mitigate those dangers. And some COVID-related data had political, institutional, sensitive aspect. Many had a personal component. So we should be very precise in defining something as open. Because as my probably last word, I should say that fair was not equal to open. Fair does not mean that it is open, and I think that such data can generally only be accessed partially and in controlled circumstances. And for these to be achieved, it should be fair, because as one of the statement of the fair data, that it is as open as possible and as closed as necessary. Just to keep it in mind here.
Thank you so much. Dr. Granados, do you have some final remarks, please?
Yes, I think I want to weave two comments from the panelists. One is this concept of not going backwards and the concept of embracing. I think that we are at a pivotal moment in the progression of the adoption of open science practices, in that I think there's also a public support for these practices. We often talk a lot about, we have to get, change the culture within the research community, but I think what may take us over that tipping point is also having the public embrace these practices, having the public have these expectations that this is the way that we do science. That goes for academic scientists, but even more for the scientists that work for governments, for nations, because they do the science on behalf of their citizens. And so if we have those expectations, and we of science being open, of science being transparent, of science being accessible, like understandable, the science communication aspect, then I think that the movement can move forward beyond just understanding that we need to do open science to, actually becoming the status quo.
So I think what we've been witnessing the effects of climate change for years, and just in the last few weeks, we've seen devastating impacts of climate change, from 50 degrees centigrade temperatures and fires burning in British Columbia to raging floods in Central Europe and drought and famine in Madagascar. And we need to, the scientific community responded in the COVID crisis, and we need to treat climate change like the global crisis it is. It's going to impact all of our lives and people around the world. And that means that we need to have a commensurate response, as the scientific community did with COVID-19, to manage the climate crisis. That requires extensive effort on the policy front. We have to continue this momentum and not look back. We need to rethink the way that we conduct and communicate science. We need to adopt some radical initiatives, as Jenny had mentioned, and it's only with building these global solutions for openness that we're going to be able to build a resilient system that can respond to some of the challenges that we're facing.
Thank you so much, Dr. Barber. Half a minute, just some closing remarks from you. Thank you.
Thank you. Look, I just think we have a moment in time to drive change now because of the pandemic, but actually, just really importantly, we have better infrastructure, more technical and more policy expertise than we've ever had before. We can do this. We can design a system that supports equity, equality and open science, but we've got to be imaginative in what that system looks like and not be limited by the systems we've been bound by in the past. Just one quote I'll take from The Guardian that came from today, which is that we can't succumb to the toxicity of cynicism and hopelessness, which can become reasons to do nothing. I think we have an opportunity now to do something. Thank you.
So thank you very much to our panelists, and thank you very much for your positive sort of remarks here right at the end. And I agree, this is an opportunity. I think for the first time, it's really staring us in the face. And with this, I want to thank our participants and hand over then to the chair. Thank you, Chair.
Thank you very much, Ms. Veldman. Thank you wholeheartedly for guiding this session and presenting some valuable outcomes from this discussion. I want to also thank the presenters. I want to thank Dr. Barbu, Dr. Granados, Dr. Ripkina, and Dr. Naim for finding the time to join us in their very busy schedule. I think we're now coming to the close of the day slowly. As I mentioned at the opening, the two rapporteurs of the day will produce some main points that came out of this wonderful and thoughtful and informative and insightful discussions. If I can crudely wrap up, in a hurry, I must say, I think we heard from UNESCO about the recommendation Open Science, which is to be adopted by the UNESCO General Assembly at the end of 2021. We're glad to hear that now there are international agreed definitions and terms into that recommendation, and also the urging of the Assistant Director General towards scientific humanism. A recurring aspect from the discussions today and a recurring actually requirement is that clear scientific communication to combat mistrust in science must be on the table every moment when we talk about communicating science and communicating scientific outputs. It was also clear from the speakers from across two panels and the keynote speaker, and as well as the questions, the many questions which we received and the speakers received. It is evident that we need an open research ecosystem. However, speakers have noted that the coronavirus content has slowly started shifting behind the paywall again. The aspect of research integrity was put forward from the first policymakers panel, which I think remains as an important aspect in all discussions about the open scientific process. We also heard from the many national policies and how these policies developed in Japan, the United States, and the European Commission. We note with interest the framework for designing or the redevelopment of a reward and incentive system that we saw from the European Commission, and we would like to hear more about this framework. We also note from the second panel about the huge shift in data sharing on the national level in Russia. And of course, the fact that there is a recognized need to unite existing systems, the importance of data science platforms and infrastructures to be based on fair principles, and the need for accelerated implementation of the fair ecosystem and the enhanced services of co-data. It was also very interesting to hear that less than 1/3 interdisciplinary publications mentioning COVID-19 were not open access, and the urging of the community towards a systemic transition of the entire system of scholarly publishing into open access. The global embrace of open data was strengthened and mentioned by many speakers. However, it is interesting to note that releasing data alone is not enough. There is a need for systematic analysis preservation systems in place. It is now a pivotal moment. The momentum is great, and it is a great opportunity for the open science community to move forward to an open research or open knowledge ecosystem. And as the last comment, I would like to repeat again the comment that was shared in the Q&A from a colleague from Claxco, Argentina, that we should remember that the creators of the web at CERN did not patent it, allowing us to benefit from it. So that could work as an example we should follow in innovations for open science, for the open science infrastructures and ecosystems. We will have a dedicated panel on that in the next days. This crudely sums up the first day of this conference. I want to thank everyone for joining us online. I want to offer our gratitude for your enhanced interest in this conference and this framework of open science, which is important for all of us that are present in this conference. I'd like to mention that tomorrow we start at 8 a.m. New York time, and the keynote speaker of the day tomorrow is Professor Bolton from the International Science Council. I'm sure you all know him. And once again, thank you for joining us. Have a wonderful afternoon, evening, or early morning. Thank you.